Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. I am Sabine Bernabè, World Bank Group Vice President and the Director General of the Independent Evaluation Group. Thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome back to those of you who attended yesterday's rich and engaging discussion on the potential of the blue economy for climate action. For today's session, we will turn our attention to resilience. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, both countries and their development partners have recognized the need to build social and economic resilience in the face of compounding crises. This is especially true of the need to adapt and build resilience against the impacts of climate change. As organizations such as the World Bank Group look to scale up their support for climate adaptation, agreeing on shared measures of resilience that focus on vulnerability reduction and that can be aggregated and compared is critical. Measuring resilience was the focus of IEG's urban resilience evaluation, where we developed a model to measure the nonlinear pathways pursued by people and systems to cope, adapt, and transform in the face of compounding shocks and stresses, such as pandemics and climate impacts. Disaster risk reduction is also a critical element of resilience building. Our recent disaster risk reduction evaluation found that rigorous analytical work that quantified disaster and climate risks and assessed costs and benefits was a major contributor to government buy-in. At the same time, there is a need to strengthen the way we identify, measure, and report on the effects that disaster risk reduction activities have on reduced exposure and vulnerability and increased resilience to shocks. Measuring a reduction in the negative effects of a potential future shock is a challenge, yet it can be vital for designing and making the case for interventions aimed at building resilience. Common approaches to measuring resilience could also play an important role in mobilizing private investment in adaptation. So for this session, we've brought together experts from different organizations to share their experiences and insights from their approaches to meeting the challenge of measuring resilience. With that, let me hand over to the esteemed moderator for today's event, Geeta Batra, the head of evaluation of the GEF. Over to you, Geeta.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I am Geeta Batra, Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environment Facility. Before we dive into our discussions, I would like to encourage everyone to engage with us on social media. Please use the hashtag E4CA. With that excellent introduction by Sabine, which clearly articulated the rationale and the importance for measuring resilience, we'll get started with our expert presenter and panelists. In this session, in a way, we'll be approaching climate resilience across all stages of the evaluation cycle, starting with a look at design and resilience frameworks, gathering evidence from how they're being implemented, and then developing, monitoring, and evaluation systems for ongoing measurement, and finally, ultimately sharing the knowledge generated. As Sabine mentioned, we have a very interesting lineup of speakers bringing in a range of perspectives from research and innovation to the front lines of where climate resilience policies take shape and programs are to be implemented. Jo Puri truly needs no introduction and is now a senior research scholar at Columbia University. She'll start us off with a brief presentation on various approaches for resilience finance as well as measurement. She brings decades of experience in climate and development policy, having led multiple flagship frameworks and programs, as well as academic research and evaluation work. Jo's presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with three esteemed panelists: Joseph Mouanda, Chief Evaluation Officer and focal point on climate change at the African Development Bank's Independent Evaluation Department; Sinja Puri, Team Lead for Climate Risk Finance Solutions at the UN University's Institute for Environment and Human Security and the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative; and Nate Engle, Senior Water Resources Management Specialist at the World Bank, who has looked closely at and thought about approaches for measuring resilience. With that, I'd like to hand over to Jo for her presentation. Jo, over to you.
Thank you, Geeta, very much for that introduction, and lovely to be here. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly and launch into the 10 minutes that I have. And I'm also going to put on my timer just because I know that we are running quickly. Okay, so everyone knows that within the overall climate finance numbers that we know, and these are CPI numbers, 1.27 trillion new and additional climate finance, but of that, adaptation, 63 billion, right? Mitigation in comparison, $1.15 trillion. So clearly the big challenge is there's not much money coming into adaptation. This is what COP29 is also bringing to us. And hopefully we will be talking about the global goal on adaptation in the discussion. Quickly, I'm not going to discuss the meaning of resilience. Hopefully, many of you know it, but it's really the ability to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt, transform, etc. from hazards. But really, the key thing in terms of measuring resilience is recognizing the two levels, the two scales at which we are working. One is the individual level, right, at the household level. The second is at the systems level, the community level. And really recognizing that any measurement needs to bring both of those aspects in. The third idea I just want to pin down, other than saying that, of course, there's very little money going into adaptation and therefore into resilience. And the second, that it is a question of scales as well, is that we are seeing a lot of fragmentation within the overall resilience space. So whether, depending on which sector expert you are, nutrition, water, jobs, wealth, livelihoods, etc., you're really thinking about resilience in a very fragmented way, while the households on the ground really need a far more holistic, a non-siloed perspective on resilience and on their adaptive capacity. And this is really the challenge of measurement, right? And I think, and this is, I think also given the big focus that I have on finance, the key challenge in the very low levels of money that we are seeing flow into adaptation is a function of not just the information asymmetries that we are witnessing and the constrained capacities that we are witnessing within the adaptation space, but I think one of the key and top challenges is the inability to measure. So that's all I'm focusing on right now. Okay. Now, just making you diverting your attention a little bit, DVAL, and because DVAL is co-supporting this event as well, and us, while I was at the GCF, we tried to understand what do we know about what works in resilience and in adaptation. And clearly, you'll notice that I'm using the two words interchangeably, but hopefully during Q&A, we can discuss that. And in the overall evidence map, which looked at the kinds of interventions, but also the kinds of outcomes, we found that there was very little to make us understand as to what works in improving institutional capability and systems capacity. So that's the first takeaway. As we think about, well, you know, the inability to measure the overall consequences of resilience and adaptation, the first takeaway is that a lot of this is to do with institutional change and capacity building, where there is very little evidence. So the blank spaces on this chart essentially show that we have very, very little evidence. If you have colored spaces, it means you've got those pieces of evidence. So the darker the color, the more the evidence. So moving into this and recognizing, and this is some of the work that we're doing at IFAD, where I'm very happy to talk about that, we decided that, look, we needed to understand resilience at both those levels, both the individual level as well as the systems level, while recognizing that there are many parts of this overall curve, right? So anything that goes into adaptation capacity building and is helping you bring about this resilience dividend can be to reduce the magnitude of disruption, reduce the duration of resistance, or reduce the duration of recovery of disruption. So again, there's a temporal element. Other than the scale element, there is a temporal element to adaptation, and the consequence of which is there is a temporal element to resilience as well. So we put together an index called the ability to recover index. Now, there's separate monitoring that goes on as well at the individual level, and we can talk about that. But really, this idea is to both measure at the household level as well as at the community level, both for areas where EFAD investments are going in. So EFAD invests approximately $10 billion every 3 years, and then there's additional co-financing that comes in. And we compare that, the same measure that we are trying to understand at the level of the areas where we are going in with investments, we are also looking at areas where EFAD investments are not going in. And that's both at the household level as well as at the community level. And the ability to recover index captures both the incidence of a shock, the severity of a shock, as well as the perceptions of the household with respect to their ability to recover. So it gives both the subjective as well as the objective measure of whether a household has both experienced a shock, and that's the objective measure, the intensity of the shock, that's the objective measure, but also what their perceptions are, whether they are worse off, same as before, or better off compared to before the shock occurred. Notice that we do this at the household level, but then we aggregate to the community level. So we get it for all of the areas where we are going in, at the community level and at the system and at the entire geographic area level. And then we do this for the counterfactual areas as well. So even though they may be recovering because of their own social networks and because of other things in the counterfactual areas, we recognize that by comparing, and of course the counterfactual areas are picked with a huge amount of care, we are then able to see as to what the additionality is of the investment at an overall aggregate level. And this then makes me get to, so this is what is called a forest plot. And what you're seeing here is a meta-analysis where we are seeing essentially that across 24 investments that are randomly selected, we are essentially able to do both a meta-analysis and get the aggregate effect size. That is, if you pooled all of the data, compared, and this is the counterfactual data as well as the treatment data, and then looked at what was the additional impact that investments were making, we are able to conclude with high levels of confidence that the average change that we made in the overall resilience of communities that EFAD investments were going in on was 13%. This is the idea that we are using essentially to measure the overall resilience additionality that is caused by EFAD investments. Key things, this is pathway agnostic. It does not matter which area or sector that you're coming into. And of course, it also recognizes that not all investments are going to be successful. You're really taking a very portfolio approach in really understanding as to whether you're improving the resilience at a portfolio level or not. I want to just quickly use, and I know that I have 2 minutes, to then introduce this idea of resilience credits because we have our eye on COP29 and COP30. One of the key things in COP29 and COP30 is going to be how we can galvanize and scale up the additional financing that is required for adaptation. And that's going to be both within the NAPs as well as within the NDCs and on the overall global goal of adaptation. And so the idea of resilience credits is really trying to say, look, now that we know with increased technology and the marginal cost of data collection being zero, we can start to think about the ability to respond index to be measured at a highly disaggregated, highly granular fashion in real time and create a market of resilience credits where, for example, a smallholder farmer makes resilience investments that clearly he or she wants to do, but you can then, much like RED+, you can measure that improvement in resilience and convert it into a unit or a credit, depending on what the percentage improvements have been over and above the baseline, and still sell it in the market to investors. So I'm at 9 minutes right now. So to investors who are interested in investing in resilience. So really taking on board this idea that resilience has both a private good element as well as a public good element. It benefits all of us if farmers or value chains are made secure because our food supply then becomes better off. So there is a element to resilience as well as a private good element. And that's why this idea of resilience credits is essentially really critical and something that I think we can and should be taking forward. We should take advantage, and this is my last slide, of the high incidence of data that can help us to build these indices and understand with implementers as to whether there's additionality of these investments or not, and then create markets. And we want to try and pilot actually these resilience credits in a whole lot of investments. And I also invite the World Bank and the Jeff to think about that with us to see as to how we can really take it from a voluntary space, which is where carbon currently is, to a far more evolved and mature state. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jo, for highlighting the challenges in measurement, scale, systems, the need for using multidimensional frameworks, measuring institutional building and capacity building, all challenges we face regularly in our evaluation work. But thanks for also sharing some of the recent approaches that cover recovery from disruptions, adaptive capacity, risk mitigation, long-term sustainability, at both the household and the systems level, which I think is important, while trying to assess the additionality of investments. I mean, this is a challenge, right, for all evaluators. But I think your presentation has set a good stage for our panelists to reflect on some of their own experiences in measuring resilience. So I'd like to turn to Joseph first. I'd like to start with you, Joseph. Resilience is clearly an evolving concept with different meanings depending on country or local context. What tools do you and your team at AfDB use to bridge some of these differences, to measure impact, and more importantly, to inform the design and implementation of new interventions? Over to you, Joseph. You're muted. Could you turn your microphone on, please?
Sorry. Resilience is indeed a nuanced and evolving concept that varies depending on local and national context. For instance, in one country, resilience may mean adapting to frequent flooding, while in other countries, it could be about addressing economic instability or food insecurity. This contextual nature makes resilience a complex, multifaceted concept, one that requires a tailored approach across different sectors. The African Development Bank vision in the coming decade is a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and integrated Africa. In our 10-year strategy, 2024 to 2033, resilience is addressed as a critical factor in countering Africa's vulnerability to various shocks, including conflict, climate change, and economic volatility. To respond to your question, at AfDB, we adopt several evaluation tools and methods to bridge contextual difference, measure resilience impact, and inform the design and implementation of resilience building intervention. These tools and methods include contextualization, expanded theory of participatory approach, knowledge sharing and learning, mixed method, and geospatial analysis. In terms of contextualized evaluation, we tailor our evaluation to reflect each country's unique condition. For instance, in our evaluation of Nigeria country strategy and program, we focus on energy, governance, and economic diversification, given Nigeria reliance on oil. Similarly, in evaluating a sewerage project in Mauritius, we looked at resilience in terms of wastewater management in a rapidly urbanized context, considering climate risk like heavy rainfall and public health impact. Also, recognizing the fragility in around 21 of our 54 regional member countries, we use tools like the fragility and resilience lens, reinforced by the country resilience and fragility assessment, that help understand each country's unique context and fragility. Regarding the use of expanding theory of change, AfDB maps out how intervention led to a resilience outcome while identifying and for in evaluating the Lake Chad Basin Resilience Program, we define a resilience outcome across food security, livelihood diversification, and conflict mitigation. The evaluation analyzes the project assumption and adjusts the strategy to address contextual factors like cross-border conflicts, environmental degradation, and shifting agricultural practice to the climate change. Here, like in other evaluation embedding coupled human and natural system, the classic linear theory of change need to be expanded by using a system-based perspective. On participatory approach, we prioritize local stakeholder perspective in our evaluation. A concrete example is the Kenya Green Zone Development Support Project aimed at enhancing climate resilience through reforestation and community-driven natural resource management. AfDB involved local community to understand how reforestation impacts their resilience to soil erosion and drought. This engagement ensures relevant finding, lesson, and recommendation. Concerning knowledge sharing and learning, we focus on it to continuously improve the African Development Bank resilience build work. Our evaluation on green growth and climate change, for instance, guided the bank subsequent climate and green growth strategic framework, including the policy and strategy for 2021 and 2030. Finally, the use of mixed method and geospatial analysis. We apply qualitative and quantitative approaches to comprehensively capture the multifaceted nature of resilience. Mixed method is used for all our evaluation, including impact evaluation. To the complexity of resilience building intervention, we also integrate geospatial analysis alongside traditional evaluation method. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joseph. You've clearly pointed out the importance of unique country contexts, particularly since a lot of us work in conflict, fragile and conflict-affected situations. I think the point about using a systems lens, a participatory approach, of course, a combination of qualitative and quantitative approaches. So many thanks for shedding light on what evaluators should definitely be keeping in mind while evaluating resilience. But let me go to Nate next. Nate, clearly there's always this issue about how do you scale up and replicate, right? So with limited resources, it's crucial to identify those interventions that can actually be effectively scaled up or replicated. This is clearly not an easy task. And you've published several studies on resilience, including a recent one on measuring it. What do you see as some of the main challenges to identifying the right and tools for building a strong evidence base?
Thank you so much, Geeta, for that question. And I just want to say it's a real pleasure to be here with this community. I've been working for most of my career on and off on measuring resilience or concepts around adaptation. And I keep getting pulled back into these conversations around the challenges. I have to say, Joe, I was very inspired by your presentation. Thank you for that, because I think some of the challenges that I'll point out, you're with what you presented, you're starting to chip away at them. But since I was asked to talk about the challenges, I'll dive a little bit deeper into some of those first points you were raising before you got into some of the solutions you presented. So believe it or not, some of those studies that you referenced, Geeta, in your question that I was involved in are actually like almost 5 years old by now. I can't believe the time has flown by, but we're still talking about some of these challenges. They're still very relevant, almost as relevant, maybe even more relevant than they were 5 years ago. I think it speaks to the fundamental challenge that we face here. And I think Joseph's reflections pointed to this, is really just the inherent complexity of resilience as a concept. And that it is a really challenging concept to pin down into one indicator or to aggregate into a couple of indicators. And I think it's around the other issues that were raised in Joe's remarks, and also in Joseph's comment around just the context specificity, that it boils down to resilience as a context specific concept. So what builds resilience in one sector or one location at one point in time is very different compared to other locations, time points, and sectors. I think that speaks to the fragmentation that Joe mentioned in her presentation that we see. So imagine trying to boil down into one indicator, or even a set of indicators, those concepts around the definition that Joe went through really quickly: resist, absorb, adapt, transform. That is very complex to try to get indicators around, let alone one universal indicator. So I think this push to find one indicator that pulls together into one aggregable concept, or one aggregable measure, resilience, is a challenge that's going to last with us for a long time. It doesn't mean that we can't make progress on it. I think Joe's presentation is actually a really good example of how we can start to address this and create indicators that are actionable. But I also think that it speaks to the need to continue to ground our work in evidence-based and build the evidence base through case studies, through having developed theories of change that are allowing for the context specificity in measurement and really solid results chains and results frameworks. What I'll end with is really thinking about how to build the evidence base around some of the principles of resilience that are really the foundations behind those definitions, whether it be robustness or flexibility or redundancy or diversity, all of these things that we think are really foundational for building resilience at any level or different levels. I think we can start to kind of aggregate or think about what does that mean in different contexts around those principles so they can be promoted in future investments. And the last thing I'll leave you with, chance to speak to this a little bit more later, is trying to think about, in addition to what was presented by Joe, to think about the process-based types of indicators, or quantifying or rating or ranking the quality of the design of an investment itself, which I think is a really interesting way forward potentially for complementing what Joe had already presented. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Nate. I mean, again, this boils down to hearing about context specificity. And I like the point you raised about not seeking that magic bullet indicator or set of indicators, but actually relying on evidence through case studies, drafting and preparing good theories of change that capture the systems lens as opposed to the linearity we are all used to. And the need for process indicators, right? Particularly given the different situations we deal with, coming to this outcome can take forever in time. So why don't we also capture changes through process indicators? Thanks very much for that. Sinja, switching gears a little bit, you've done a lot on looking at resilience through an innovation lens. You've researched, you've designed innovative disaster risk financing and insurance solutions. So can you tell us a little bit about their potential and, more importantly, how you're measuring the impact of some of these investments? Over to you.
Thank you, Geeta, and thank you for having me today. Yeah, I'll talk a bit about the financial solutions that we're working with. So climate vulnerable communities need financial support when they're affected by extreme weather, such as hurricanes, heavy rain, heat waves, drought. So, and we know from studies that the need for financial resources increases to recover increases the longer it takes for communities to receive financial assistance after an event. So it's really time is of essence to get quick financial support to those communities. So that's where climate risk finance solutions and especially climate risk insurance can come in. The climate risk insurance solutions that we look at are parametric ones. They're different from traditional insurance in a way that with traditional insurance, you need to do a lengthy damage assessment to determine how much would be paid. And until it's paid, a lot of time can pass. So with parametric insurance, you pre-agree on determined triggers. So those could be sort of what's the level of a hurricane, how many weeks would there be without rain, how high is the level of rain, and then based on when these triggers are met in the region of the communities that are insured, then a payout is made automatically. So this can be within days compared to traditional insurance where it takes a month. So that a bit of a background. These insurance solutions or finance solutions can be looked at different levels. So ultimately, we want to protect the most vulnerable individuals and communities, but that could be through macro level, where full nations take out insurance and use money then to protect those communities. It could be at meso level, where aggregators, cooperatives, institutions that are actually implementing help could get payouts. And then, of course, individual levels. We had the examples of farmers earlier or fishermen or other small entrepreneurs. So resilience is sort of the logical and appropriate framework for us to look at the impact of such risk finance solutions. But then, and different actors in the space, being from practitioners to academia, are looking at different solutions to find the ones there is, and my previous speakers have talked about it, there's no consensus. How do we measure resilience now in the projects and with the partners we work with? So traditionally, in financial institutions, or in this case, insurers would look at insured, maybe the satisfaction with the product is most approximated through renewal rates, how much has been paid out. But of course, this is insufficient to look at the impact. So what we do is we accompany this with research and studies and surveys where we ask people about how have they used the money that they have received? What activities did it allow them to be covered? What are the needs directly, for example, after an event? Was the amount that they received sufficient? How long did it take to recover? How much, of the occurred losses and damages could be sort of mitigated with this support? And so then we compare this information with responses from communities that did not have an insurance or that have an insurance where it didn't pay out, because it's really important then to have this counterfactual and to compare not only payout versus non-payout, but also there are impacts that are not visible or that are less directly measurable, right? So having an insurance can already have an impact as well, for example, then on investment behavior and other points. So this is how we look at it. Then it's also important to compare at other dimensions that affect vulnerability to look at the resilience effect. So gender, Joe also mentioned this in the presentation, looking at gender breakdowns is very important, and other dimensions of vulnerability and resilience as well. And then these assessments can't be done for all projects, but at least for selected locations, hazards, beneficiaries and hazards. So a comparison is possible. And I think one last point is also that financial institutions themselves in implementation collect, as I mentioned earlier, just a very little amount of that data. So it's an important role of governments and regulators to request for the information that we need, be sure, to monitor if the impact of the solutions is there that we have and to adapt them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senia. I mean, sharing, and I learned a piece on parametric insurance that I wasn't familiar with, and the use of triggers. It's very helpful. And I think the looking for what you're seeking out is not just outputs and in terms of number of people reached, but you're actually looking for changes and behavior changes and more on socioeconomic outcomes, whether it's on gender or what people are doing with the resources. And I think that's very valuable in terms of, and not just a bean counting exercise. So thank you for that. We will proceed to round two. So we all understand that measurement and evaluation is just a first stage, right? And one then has to understand how this data and measurement and findings are actually used to drive and influence interventions. So in this round, let's switch gears a little bit to understand how done has or engaged in from a measurement perspective has influenced policy or operationalization through knowledge sharing and institutional support. So Joseph, Africa, as we know, faces the brunt of climate crisis at the forefront and stands at the forefront of climate resilience. How are you building the evidence to inform decision-making and policies around adaptation and of climate change? Over to you.
Thank you, Geeta. Within the African Development Bank, AfDB plays a fundamental role in advancing climate resilient and adaptation effort across Africa by focusing on two main areas. The first one is generating evaluative knowledge, and the second one in facilitating knowledge sharing for greater impact. In terms of evaluating knowledge generation, our evaluation on energy, climate change, and green growth initiative, for instance, provide insight for future strategy. For instance, the evaluation on mainstreaming green growth and climate change played a key role in shaping the African Development Bank climate and gender and green growth strategy framework, as previously indicated. While our renewable energy evaluation show how AfDB work has enhanced energy access, reduced emission, and promote economic development. In terms of knowledge sharing, AfDB is committed to its evaluative insight to shape the bank climate resilience and just transition initiative. To this end, we have developed what we call evaluative evidence uptake concept note, focused on enhancing the integration of evaluative knowledge into the design of future bank intervention in climate resilience and just energy transition. Several strategies has been identified to amplify the independent evaluation voice on this critical agenda. First, AfDB prepared a background paper for COP27 summarizing key evaluation insight on climate resilience and just transition, drawing from evaluation on energy, climate change, resilient, and green growth. Second, AfDB outlined its role in contributing to the evidence for action pavilions at COP29 and or COP2013, positioning evaluation as a key component in global climate action dialogue. Third, we actively engage in hosting and participating in events, webinars, and discussion, fostering collaboration and awareness among stakeholders in climate initiative. And finally, a resource page on our website consolidates material relative to climate resilience and just transition, offering actionable insight for the broader community. Thank you.
Many thanks for that. There's nothing more encouraging for an evaluation team to see, right? Rather than their findings actually being implemented into new strategies. So congratulations on that. And there's also a big onus on evaluators, right? So contributing past as well as real-time information of lessons learned is critical, particularly as circumstances change from one year to the next, particularly in the area of climate change. So just staying on top of it and informing from past and current lessons is imperative. So Nate, how would you bring your findings on measuring resilience to M&E systems at the country level in terms of capacity building, institutional strengthening, and knowledge sharing?
Yeah, thank you. So I think I want to maybe go back to one of the points I was making before around how to capture in this day and age the context specificity of resilience, and really emphasize again the point of having it rooted in a very robust theory of change, which your community. I think that's part and parcel of what you do, but I think that this is more and more important in areas that are super complex like resilience, but I think it's underappreciated on the ground actually, and I don't think that it's often the case. I think it's increasingly the case, but it hasn't traditionally been the case that it is so foundational to a project. So let me give you an example how we do it, or how I've done it in the operations I'm working on with clients in the water sector. So if we're developing a project or an investment, the idea is that if it has a resilience building outcome or objective as its main objective, or even a sub-objective of a project, what we do is, and what I encourage other teams to do, is to build that into the results framework from the beginning, meaning to work with the team, your team, but then also the country team, to sit down with the stakeholders and develop, using the best evidence base that we're talking about here that's been gathered, doing the necessary research to understand what the pathways to build resilience are in that particular project context, the types of investments that are being done, the different activities, and the project based on the theory of change, to help to design the project based on how it's intended to build resilience, ultimately getting towards indicators that will be able to determine if you're on that pathway or not, and help to guide the implementation of the project and make those, like you said, Geeta, the necessary course adjustments along the way if we find out we're learning about to learn from the project in terms of what is actually working or not. So, I think what that does is it works with country teams, it works helps to build country systems, it helps to build the M&E community to really appreciate this way of understanding resilience and learning from it. And I think that can create a ripple-on effect where, beyond this project, it's then building that cadre of M&E specialists that appreciate the need to look at resilience from this context-specific viewpoint, but one that is rooted in a theory of change that we can then build evidence from and extend, into other investments. And the idea is hopefully then that this group of individuals that's getting trained or getting appreciation for this type of evaluating framework for resilience can then inform other country systems and build it into their agencies and beyond the project itself. And that's what we hope to see when we're doing this type of approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. I think we'd love to see all project practitioners like you do, right? Starting with the theory of change and starting at the design stage. Otherwise, ever so often, when you come to the evaluation stage, you're pretty much reconstructing theories of change. And I think this would be a really good step if most project practitioners sitting with country teams, with the communities, could actually incorporate this whole concept of resilience right from the get-go. So Sinja, you've worked on the research and the operational side of disaster risk financing and climate finance in general. What lessons can you share about, operationalizing some of the innovations you talked about, designing complex instruments and supporting, key actors? This is clearly a challenging area, right? So I'm just wondering what lessons you've got to share.
Thanks. And maybe building upon what was already said. So one, I think, is just to let perfect not be the enemy of the good. We want to do it right. We want to design the solutions perfectly that they really address the needs of the most vulnerable. But at the same time, there is a need right now. So I've also seen products, be in the development stage for years. But I think to start implementing and then to have a good monitoring and evaluation system in place to be able to, with iterations, improve the products. And especially, for example, for insurance, products are implemented on an annual basis, so there is room to adapt as we go. So I think just to start implementing so that the solutions become available for those we want to reach. Another point is, my second point is, it takes an ecosystem of public as well as private stakeholders to design and to implement appropriate risk finance solutions and to have the enabling environment to do so. Especially for innovative solutions, it should not be underestimated how much institutional strengthening and capacity building it takes at all levels, right? So new solution, like insurance is not an easy, this is an example, but an easy product to sell. Parametric insurance, not even less. But you need to make people understand on the beneficiary level what they could get out of it, what their needs are, of course, on the demand side. On the supply side, for many insurers, it's also a new solution to be implemented. So there's a lot of capacity building needed there as well. And then, of course, also on the for the whole enabling environment, the governmental side and regulatory institutions. And there it's different bodies and contact points to look at, disaster risk management agencies, the supervisors, any stakeholder that is participating in protecting the most vulnerable. So that could be Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Social Protection, so bringing everyone together, I think, is an important point. And then just speaking to what was said, evidence-based programming. So to start, of course, to look at what is the need, what do we want to meet, starting at the design stage, but then creating feedback loops and monitoring data all over the way so that we can adjust along the way to compare solutions to see what's the best value for invested money as well. And as well to look at different components that we might not always look at. So if we look at an insurance product or a credit product or something similar, also look at the distribution. The impact can be affected by how outreach is done, how the offer is done, how the distribution is done. So some of the impact is actually not directly linked to the product, but sort of how it's distributed.
Thanks so much, Sinja, because I think you've highlighted, and I think also Jo mentioned this in her presentation. Private sector comes in when the rules of the game are fair. You've got a enabling policy and regulatory environment, and you've just alluded to policy coherence as well, right? Where the different ministries have to be on board. So I think you're not going to get the innovation, you're not going to get the risk, you're not going to get the private sector in unless you've got these the rules of the game set fairly straight and understandable to all. So I think education and outreach absolutely play an important role, both for institutions, financial institutions, as well as for the private sector. I'm going to turn to our audience that's been patiently listening and have a couple of questions. And I think this would be for Jo. How do resilience credits benefit investors? Is the idea similar to carbon markets through which firms offset their emissions?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Geeta. So yes, the idea is actually that you are, and I think Sinja said this, right? That you have to think about what is the symbiotic relationship between the private investor and government or public agencies. And clearly, you don't want to trespass on each other's roles. But here is, and what you said, Geeta, you've got to think of the market creating role of public entities, right? And the market creating role of public entities is essentially provide that space where my public good, but also my private good, which is resilience, is something that I get compensated for. And the only way you do that is by creating a market, because that's when the part of the overall public good that I'm contributing to as a smallholder or whatever is something that I can get compensated for by creating it that I can get payment for. And so just as the public agencies have created these markets for carbon, but not just carbon, also for ESG, think about creating exactly that market for resilience where you're benefiting the people who are generating resilience by paying them for it. Over.
Thanks. That was really crystal clear. I think this may be for Joe as well as for Senia, Joseph as well as for Senia. Have you conducted any resilience measurement efforts in fragile or post-conflict settings across multiple resilience shocks, drought, landslides? Can you share some of your methodological approaches that you've used in such contexts?
Can I just make a quick remark? Can I make a quick remark and then I'll hand it over to the others? So we have, and I think I showed that in the meta-analysis. So for example, in Pakistan, in Mali, in a lot of the fragile and conflict-affected areas, we continue to do measurements. And the nice thing, and I think Sinja said this, but also others, let not the best be the enemy of the good. The nice thing is that with those measurements, the key thing is having a counterfactual. The contribution or the addition that you can measure comes out, right? In whatever measure, whether it's the Fowry measure, whether it is the ability to respond measure, you've got to think about what it is that will galvanize investment. And the only way you can do that is to think at a portfolio level and to think about what is the additional contribution that you're making to resilience as a consequence of your investment. And that's why I think that and so we've done this in a lot of the fragile areas. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But that's why the portfolio level measurement is really useful, because then investors can come in and say, look, performance-based financing, we'll pay you if at least 10% of your overall portfolio or of your investment is making a difference to resilience. Over.
Yeah, the portfolio level approach is important here. Joseph and Senia, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, just to add that, as I did mention, we have around 21 countries out of 54 which are on what we call a fragile situation. And the bank has a special framework, a special strategy for this kind of country. So we did an evaluation for this strategy, and our finding was used to prepare the new strategy. And mainly, I can say that also when we are conducting a thematic or sector evaluation, we are covering all countries, including this, which was called a fragile state, but we no longer say fragile state, we say country in fragile situation. So always we are doing a country or thematic or sector evaluation, we have an aspect of fragility and resilience. And we can find, I already shared the link for the just transition, but the same way you can find other evaluation done by AfDB, mainly with fragile state or fragile condition country. Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming close to the end, and I'm going to allow our speakers one lightning round of 30 seconds. What is the key evidence you'd like policymakers to take on at COP29? So I'm going to start with Joseph. I'll start with Joe, and then we go to our panelists. 30 seconds. What's the key evidence you'd like policymakers to take on?
I'll do it in less than that. I need resilience measurement with counterfactuals.
Okay. Joseph? You're muted.
Policymakers must recognize that effective climate action in Africa requires strong international support to strengthen local data system, advance community-led adaptation, and foster cross-regional knowledge sharing. Our evaluation also highlights the need to address climate resilience for project quality at entry with sound project design, an effective participatory process, and a better risk assessment and management. Too much for them, but they need to do it.
Thank you. Nate?
Just 2 points. So I think the first, while I totally agree with the message of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, I think I would caution to be careful when relying too heavily on or going towards a universal indicator to guide policy and decision making. It's helpful and useful, but just to make sure it's caveated carefully and just to be aware that it may miss certain elements of resilience or may even incentivize certain things that have unintended consequences, because everyone knows what we measure actually can inform decision making and policies subsequently. The second point is to look and consider process-based measures. And I said I would maybe elaborate on this a little bit more, but I'll say in 10 seconds, this is things like rating the quality of the investment itself as it's designed. You can put a rating or a grade on that, similar to what we've developed at the World Bank in the resilience rating system. And I think this could actually also influence investment decisions and build markets. So to consider this as well. Thank you.
And Sinja?
Thanks. Also 2 points, and one speaks to Nate. Multidimensional, so to really look at different dimensions and measures when measuring it. And then the other one is we need all hands on deck. So to think of creating sort of the enabling and conducive environment for private and public stakeholders to do their part. And I think that goes for evidence investments as well as then for the implementation.
Thank you all. What a great panel and presenter, right? So I'm just going to have a few closing remarks just to synthesize very quickly. It highlighted that the session clearly highlighted advancing resilient measurement requires risk assessments and vulnerability mapping, detailing risk assessments at local and regional levels, as well as at national levels, include incorporating socioeconomic factors like poverty, inequality, migration, integrating local knowledge with science, creating an enabling environment for both public and private sector, building public awareness, capacity, stakeholder engagement, and long-term monitoring and evaluation, prioritizing collection of real-time environmental data, assess risks and vulnerabilities, and track these over time. So this would actually make sure that policymakers understand that resilience is important for sustainability, it's cost-effective, and it promotes equity and inclusivity. So this brings us to the end of our session. I'd like to thank IEG as well as DVAL for making this possible. I'd also like to thank all our speakers profusely for all their contributions. I've learned a lot as an evaluator. I'm sure many of you have as well. Please tune in tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern Time or 3 p.m. Central European Time for the third session of the Evidence for Climate Action series, which will be about climate finance. Hope to see you all there. Thank you all very much.